Hello, everyone. This is your host, Philip Reiner. I wanted to welcome you to The Fourth Leg. This is a series of podcasts focused on one of the most complex systems in the world today, nuclear command and control, and its increasingly complicated future. Within this series, we're going to go straight to the experts across multiple sectors to talk about the modernization of nuclear command and control systems. Keep an eye on technology for global security in the coming weeks and months as we begin to launch additional podcast series focused on how to fix the internet, AI and global security, and other critical technology and security related issues. For now, we have so much to talk about. Let's get started. For today's podcast, we are joined by our colleague Peter Hayes from the Nautilus Institute. We were very happy to have the chance to engage with Dr. Jon Lindsay, currently a professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto. Jon has a political science PhD from MIT, a master's degree in computer science from Stanford. He's a retired U.S. Naval Intelligence Officer, and on and on. His scholarly research examines the relationship between technology and international security, with published works really focusing on a range of international security issues, including China, counterterrorism, cybersecurity, and cross-domain deterrence. Jon joins us today to discuss at greater length the paper and presentation he submitted as part of the NC3 workshop back in January, which includes quite a bit about the challenges around issues such as the assumption coming in the door that the adversary is already in your system when considering the cyber elements of any 21st century architecture for NC3 systems. So Jon, thank you for joining us. I really actually wanted to kind of take a quick step back as we start the conversation here today to talk about some pretty heavy issues, thinking about cyber and nuclear weapons and nuclear command and control, but actually take a step back and thinking about your background with thinking deeply and writing and experience with all things from grand strategy to thinking about China to recent work, cross-domain issues, deterrence. You've also spent time on the ground with SOF, if I'm not mistaken. So just wanted to kind of take a step back if we could and maybe hear from you a little bit about your background and how you've come to a point where you find yourself writing about things like cyber weapons and nuclear weapons and how they come together.
Great. Thanks for asking that question. I think it's a good way to actually provide some background on some really substantively important issues that we'll talk about in the nuclear command and control realm specifically, because this really does grow out of my experience in the military and then later academic experience, which has brought me here. And it'll seem circuitous, but actually it is quite cumulative. So I have probably about 10 years active duty in the U.S. Navy. And that spanned a variety of conflicts. I was a targeting officer during the Kosovo War, spent some time on the ground in Iraq, 2007, 2008, with the Special Operations Task Force.
Right.
I was managing non-lethal operations, including information operations, and a little bit of time with Naval Special Warfare in Latin America between those two conflicts. So I kind of want to emphasize that my experience operationally is more on the medium to low end of the conflict spectrum. I don't have any direct experience in the nuclear command and control realm, but I think there'll be some important themes that we need to carry over. In those experiences, I got very interested in how organizations and technologies interact. And the general theme of most of my research throughout the past 10 years has been on what I call the informational turn in war. And this is a long-term trend in which we see military practitioners doing more intellectual rather than physical work, right? So rather than carrying weapons and fighting with people on the mud in the battlefield, which a smaller minority certainly still does, you see a lot more people that are working in office-like conditions. They're working with information technologies, they're talking remotely, they're working remotely, their experience is fundamentally mediated by technology. So there are a lot of questions that arise. What are they actually doing? What's going on? What does that mean for military power? war, so on and so forth. The kind of first phase of my research was really looking at exactly that question of what are people doing, what I call information practice. And we have this narrative that when you network organizations together, they fight more effectively and more efficiently. And as lots of people have pointed out, there's a great deal of uncertainty, friction, chaos, misunderstanding that happens in actual military operations. So that's a pretty familiar argument about complexity undermining performance. But I think what is unappreciated is that when you spend time in any complex organization, certainly operational military organizations, you also see people constantly adapting and improvising in response to that complexity, improvising their own software fixes, coming up with new creative ways to manage and represent information. So I've been really interested in kind of this back and forth dynamic between uncertainty and friction and this bottom-up improvisation that is ubiquitous in military organizations. So if that's fundamental to the way that information-intensive militaries work, or information-intensive business organizations for that matter, then cybersecurity obviously becomes pretty interesting. If technology is fundamental for creating advantages, then you want to perhaps protect and exploit those technologies. You're going to use technology to do it, but you're going to run into a lot of the same and similar problems. So it's really important to bear in mind, and kind of the theme that runs throughout my cyber security work is that this isn't just an interaction between complex technologies, it's an interaction between complex organizations. So you have an organization of people that are trying to understand and attack or exploit a system. Then you have an organization of people that are the target, that are responding to and dealing with that situation, maybe counterattacking. So it's sort of a second order information practice. That led naturally to kind of an interest in, well, strategically, then how do you start to think about these new forms of cyber interactions in a multi-domain or cross-domain situation? And that's what kind of way down the road eventually brings me to interest in nuclear command and control, talking about how can we think about what we know from information-intensive cyber operations and think about situations where we have no data and no experience, thank goodness, in this realm.
Yeah, and I look forward to going down this rabbit hole with you and talking about this at a great level of granularity in terms of how you see it, what potential risks are out there and what have you. But I guess maybe at the outset, then from that more strategic perspective and thinking about, there's I'd argue, a growing body of literature available for those who want to think about how, quote unquote, cyber may have an impact and a role when it comes to nuclear weapons. But
Mm-hmm.
the command and control piece, the literature is a little less, it's still at a pretty high level of discussion. So I'd be curious if maybe we kick it off by asking,
Right.
what do you think is, at the core of what is important to be thinking about when it comes to command, control, and communications and, quote unquote, cyber?
So I think I'm going to take that in reverse order. I think starting with the quote unquote cyber piece, and I like that you put that in air quotes because I tend to do the same. I think this is widely misunderstood as this new realm, this new domain, if you will, as if there's this new virtual geography. What we're really talking about when we talk about cyber things are technologies that help us to communicate, visualize, represent, and store information, right? That's a word that comes out of the cybernetics movement, which is fundamentally focused on the control of machines, organizations, organisms, right? So that word cyber really translates directly to control. It's from a Greek word that means steersman. Okay, so to the degree that we're talking about cyberspace, right, we're talking about the means of control, which in the 21st century are increasingly digital. And the same tools that allow you to control your supply chains, control your military operations, control your government administration, tax people more efficiently, entertain yourself, what have you. The means of control then become attractive targets for those that would want to undermine or exploit that control. So I just say that to kind of back us away from a focus on the technology specifically and really looking at those other words that you used: communications, control, command, those functions that are the intellectual functions of an organization that allow it to understand and deliberately act in the world.
Yeah. I appreciate the beginning with that characterization. Conversations that we have around all things cyber are so broad reaching. Right? I mean, you're talking about everything from ransomware to DDoS, you name it, much less the malware kinds of things that are inherently part of what might need to take place when going after an NC3 system. So,
Yeah, I even though I've written a lot on cyber, I often say that we should stop using that word altogether. And I hope that 10 years from now, we won't say cybersecurity. We'll just talk about security, because you can't talk about security without going by, with, and through these large scale technical systems.
one of the things that we've talked about and talked to others who have done research and analysis into these issues is this question of what incentives do states that are actually capable of heading down this path, what incentives would they actually have to try and penetrate NC3 with these kinds of capabilities? And what is really, in this day and age, a realistic assessment of the existing capabilities of nation states to be able to do exactly that, to actually get into nuclear command and control via these cyber means?
Right. So, I mean, the functional attraction, I think, should be fairly obvious. People often compare a command and control system to the nervous system of a person. This is a flawed analogy in some ways, but useful in others. If you were going to be fighting somebody, right, you could try and overpower them by force. If you just shot them in the head, it wouldn't matter how strong they were. You took away their ability to do anything about it. So there's this idea that no matter how much force you might have or how far it might be able to reach, if you can take away the ability for the other side to understand that it needs to use it, to see that there's a threat, to send commands to those forces, then you get an outsized military advantage. Similarly, if you could paralyze somebody, or if you could rationally or rationally convince somebody that you shouldn't be fighting in the first place, then you've used kind of the tools of persuasion or the tools of deception to get somebody to see it your way without fighting. So I think that's the general attraction. So military organizations have these same functions. The reason I mentioned it's not a good analogy is organizations are more fundamentally distributed. There usually is not that one brain case where you can shut down an entire organization. They're made of lots of people, lots of organizations, for lots of reasons, kind of designed that way for redundancy. They are that way by nature because they're social systems. But they still need to see what's going on in the world, make sense of it, send commands out. And to the degree that those functions are increasingly reliant on digital technologies for gathering and processing signals, for processing the communications between members of the same organization, for getting communications out of a target organization to understand how it's put together to do targeting and to get early warning, and then to send signals to your own forces. All of those would be interesting from both an intelligence and an electronic warfare perspective. So that's where the cyber NC3 interaction comes in.
And so, if we can just keep going down this line, the conversations that we've been a part of and that I've read a bit about some of the outcomes from, just taking this from a very practical perspective, in order to actually do such things, you are taking significant risk because of the
Yeah.
very real possibility of,
Yeah.
you poking around in somebody else's system, they're even remotely adept at what they do, they're going to know this at some point.
Yeah.
And that's one thing, poking around in a power grid. It's another getting into somebody's oil and gas refineries, if you will, and so on and so forth. Right? You can seize Baltimore up and put money on the table, but it's a whole another order of magnitude in terms of risk when you start poking around inside a nuclear command and control system. Obviously, there are the dual use systems that are increasingly more prevalent, really not just in the United States, but around the world when it comes to command and control. There are systems that are going to quite simply be for conventional purposes that have second usefulness in the event of a potential nuclear conflict. But that sort of, even if you've got the capability to go down that path, right, you're potentially invoking the rage of your adversary in a way that's really on a different level. So I guess the other layer to the question then becomes, I mean, do we really think that there is? Well, maybe talk a little bit about from what your research and your perspective, what an assessment of existing, I don't know, not just maybe capabilities, but willingness to go down such a path might be.
Yeah, I think that there are two very different sets of questions that often get conflated and are really important to distinguish here. And one is the operational problem of how technically is it possible to do something? What kinds of organizational capacity do you need? What kind of human expertise? What kind of intelligence support? What kind of organizational abilities do you need to run a remote collection or influence operation? And usually that's a lot more difficult than most people think, right? Technology says, okay, there's a connection, there's a digital computer. We see hacking all over the place. If you could hack that, then bad things would happen. Well, actually doing that turns out to be really difficult, and I think we should talk a bit about that. But secondarily, and this kind of gets into the next part of your question, is all right, if you hold all that constant and assume that you're dealing with a capable actor that has all of that ability, what would be the utility of that, of them doing it, and what kinds of risk factors would they be thinking of in interaction with the other side? So these are all more strategic considerations of how is the other side going to interact? What's my theory of victory in actually employing these capabilities in a particular situation? And those are two really, really different questions. But there's an important overlap as well, because given that hacking any industrial control system, but absolutely command and control systems, is so very difficult, even the best actors are going to make mistakes. If you're going to make mistakes, there's a possibility that you're going to be discovered. And so what are going to be the consequences of that discovery, right? It may include something as simple but still consequential as the other side deciding to change their systems to lock you out. And then now all of the months and perhaps years of preparation you've done is lost to you.
Yeah.
It may be a little bit more severe. They may look at what you're doing. You were just doing an intelligence reconnaissance, but now you're in their sensitive operational systems. They assume that your intelligence penetration is actually a preparation for some kind of preemptive strike. Now then they start to take different measures. They perceive you as aggressive. Maybe they start to put other things in motion, and on up the chain. So I think those are the kind of different ways that I would start to think about this.
Yeah, and I mean, when it comes to various nation-state capabilities that are out there, right, you see a proclivity on the part of some to be much more obvious about what they do, some who are much more adept at keeping it pretty quiet and not really even known.
Well, and the actors that you're mentioning have very different purposes in their cyber operations. And this is so important because, when we're talking about, penetrating nuclear command and control, we're talking about such a very, very specialized and very difficult operation that is really, really different from the espionage, influence, information operations, and control and criminal activity that we see in cyberspace. Is the vast majority of things that we're worried about in the cybersecurity realm. So when people are very, very noisy, like the Russians are or like the Chinese are, part of it is that you want it to be known that the Russians or the Chinese government's involved because there's some kind of coercive message that's being sent there. But if you are the NSA, for example, or any other organization that's doing high-grade, sensitive, close-in collection operations, you just don't want to be found at all, right? Because the goal is to collect and to continue collecting information, not to send any message at all. If you've sent a message, you've failed from his perspective.
Fully.
But Jon, Peter Hayes here, you're correct. This is, a dangerous game that set in motion all sorts of dynamics, but states have actually engaged in this kind of counter NC3 operation before using electronic means, right? During the Cold War.
Oh yeah, absolutely, absolutely. So, I'm always walking this fine dance between what is possible and what I think is likely based on the organizational and strategic incentives. So, is cyber or electronic warfare use for preemptive counterforce operations possible? Yes, absolutely. So in the Cold War, we now know, thanks to the East German intelligence services, actually, some former East German officers wrote about, they're kind of bragging about their successes after the Cold War. In there was a military intelligence, U.S. Army military intelligence soldier, as well as an airman, that they turned and provided them information about U.S. command and control and electronic warfare plans, specifically targeting Soviet command and control. So in late 1984, 1985, the East Germans became aware of and passed on to the Soviets this plan that was in this U.S. Special Access Program called Canopy Wing. And Canopy Wing was a research program. Okay, it's not clear how much of this was actually operationalized, but the Americans spent a ton of money on a wide range of activities, which included electronic warfare attacks against Soviet communication systems. This would include physical attacks against command and control bunkers using precision guided munitions. It would include carbon fiber and chemical means to disrupt communications. There's some interesting discussion of kind of electronic disruption, not clear if that's jamming or a rudimentary form of a computer network attack, as well as, interestingly, the use of Voice of America and Radio Free Europe to broadcast disinformation or maybe even use their broadcast facilities for various forms of electronic warfare. So it was this kind of wide range of kinetic and non-kinetic activities that were designed to accompany a U.S. counterforce strike. We say counterforce strikes against Soviet nuclear forces, and particularly their command and control nodes. So Canopy Wing and all of these things, they would never have been used independently, right? They always would have been complements in this larger multi-domain offensive to attack the Soviets.
In that relatively simple, relatively bipolar world, the United States versus the Soviet Union, with the sort of balance of terror,
Yeah.
keeping both of them cautious about each other, you have this combination of electronic and analog, largely insertion, if you like, that would have created confusion and distraction and delay if they were to attack us first, or if we were in the process of a damaging, limiting first strike against them. In that world, which was very dangerous, but only two players, they already took the risk, at least on the American side. We assume the Soviets did their best in the other direction, although I don't know any specific history
Yeah.
showing that they penetrated American command and control. But I know of instances where American missileers on the ground during the Cuban Missile Crisis were concerned that the messages they were getting might have been from the Warsaw Bloc simulating American orders, and therefore they didn't act on them at the time. So clearly that was a perception and a concern on both sides. Today, if the cyber warriors assume, and this is what I understood from reading your paper, various papers on this topic, is that the other or the adversary is already inside your system, because it's really impossible to stop them getting inside at one level or another, even though it's very difficult. Does that mean that the only players who are likely to do that are other nuclear weapon states, precisely because you wouldn't actually take up, you wouldn't respond to the gauntlet that they're thrown down by virtue of their cyber presence that you must assume the other side may have discovered? And at the same time, does that also mean you probably are assuming there are 8 nuclear weapon states inside one's own ninth nuclear command and control system, there being 9 nuclear weapon states with nuclear command and control systems on the planet.
Okay.
And that makes it just very complex.
Yeah, a lot of interesting issues to kind of tug at. I'd push back a little bit on the claim that the Cold War was simple and easy to understand. I think the more that we learn about command and control in the Cold War, and specifically the more that we learn about this new nuclear historiography, which is revealing the sophistication and commitment on the American side to various forms of counterforce doctrine, technologies, and postures, it looks anything but simple. So I'm kind of just point that out. And it is interesting that the exploration of these additional electronic warfare complements were always predicated on some sort of nuclear interaction. So I will take that as a really important thing that you point out, that hey, at least in the Cold War, we knew that we were always talking about the potential of large scale nuclear combat, going toe to toe with the Ruskies, as it were. And so anything that you were going to do, whether it was with your submarines or various kind of intricate forms of signaling with navies and air forces, or whether it was just a purely warfighting mechanism like Canopy Wing appears to be, it was always going to be in the context of a large-scale exchange. And that assumption has certainly changed in this so-called second nuclear age. But the second thing that you mentioned is, hey, this assumption that the enemy is always inside. And I think we need to put lots and lots of asterisks, along that side. That, I mean, if it was really, really true, and we just had to assume that the enemy was always inside, the enemy had an automatic kill switch on anything that we were going to do, then you would certainly have to discount your confidence in all of your systems. But if you still wanted to have those systems, then you'd start building, additional redundancies and different kinds of things. But I think, given that it is so hard to actually penetrate and develop an operational capability for these, that could be a problematic assumption. Okay. And what it might mean is that you need to spend a lot of time doing the monitoring, doing the counterintelligence work. You're going to find probes. Just because you found a probe doesn't mean that you found an operational capability. And you want to make sure the other side knows that. And so you kind of want to get into this monitoring and counterintelligence game that then tells the other side that it is costly to be there, but now you're competing in the intelligence realm rather than in the kind of crisis interaction realm. So peacetime monitoring, counterintelligence, constant vigilance, creating a culture of secrecy, all of these things are to the good, and can, I think, really lower the probability that you're going to have those penetrations in the first place. I just think that there are very, very few actors that are able to even start to think about doing that, because it's access, placement, supporting intelligence, the technological access to ability to maintain vulnerabilities as they're going stale, which they constantly are, really puts some very high barriers to entry into the penetration of these systems.
I just want to say I find it fascinating that you remark, and maybe we can come back to this, and I'll let Peter continue with this line. But the notion that it actually lowers the probability that that there's an inclination towards this sort of activity. Would you argue that may be applicable? So we're constantly thinking about China and Russia and the United States. Would you say that is the same for for other nuclear weapon states who may not necessarily have the same levels of sophistication and may feel a little more emboldened because they've got some capability in this space to go ahead and try it out at risk of potentially getting caught sideways? I think of the India-Pakistan example, I guess.
Sure. I'm not super familiar with the details of the Indian and Pak, command and control systems. A little more familiarity on the American Chinese side. What we do know is that the Chinese, certainly the Russians as well, but it's very clear in the Chinese that they are very attracted to this idea of gaining some kind of informational advantage through space and cyberspace means. They look at it as the key to American power, and therefore undermining these networks being the key to countering the United States. But a lot of that is kind of very aspirational writing. So you take that and then you couple it to these kind of very vigorous industrial espionage and political control campaigns that the Chinese are engaged in. And then it's easy to assume that, they've got the doctrine, there's doing this other stuff. That hidden category must be filled with some actual operational capability. And that is certainly possible. But that's when, I then want to start thinking through, okay, well, what would be the actual incentives for them to go ahead and do that? They certainly talk about how important it's going to be. And from a warfighting perspective, it makes a ton of sense, right? When we're talking about fighting a war, like electronic warfare, command and control attacks, the logic is very, very obvious and very, very attractive. It's the classic logic of maneuver warfare. What becomes really interesting is when you then couple those warfighting incentives for using this to the stability of deterrence, which is the whole point of having nuclear weapons in the first place. And now we start to get into some really interesting interactions, contradictions, and risk factors. So the paper was really trying to look at those strategic tensions, even though everything I've been talking to up until now in this podcast has been more on the operational level, saying that to actually get to that point is really, really difficult. But if we get to that point, then we've got some problems that we need to worry about.
Well, John, in the paper you mapped out, I think it was no less than 21 what you called cyber nuclear escalation mechanisms that included accidental launch, bolt from the blue, counterforce overconfidence, confusion from cyberspace, etc. The sort of 21 new on-ramps on the freeway to nuclear war, is that what you've sort of identified here, as if we didn't already have enough?
Yes, we do have a lot. What the paper doesn't look at is any of the off-ramps, right? The ways in which information technology may actually improve your reliability and resilience. But yes, so the number 21 is pretty arbitrary. If it makes you think of gambling, that's what I was going for. But I did want to try and get a little more specific about the ways in which reliance on digital technology could supercharge a nuclear brinksmanship crisis and make the use of nuclear weapons or the escalation to a higher level of use more likely. And one of the key reasons I wanted to do this was, and this is building on my work with Eric Gartsky here at UC San Diego, is to try and distinguish those pathways which depend on rational incentives based on the nature of cyber and nuclear capabilities to escalate versus things that depend on non-rational, sub-rational, bounded rational, emotionally charged, kind of actual human decision-making, okay? And most of the discussion around kind of cyber command and control vulnerabilities focuses on the latter, right? It's kind of the sense that, in time of war, people will start hacking and you realize you can't trust your systems and everybody's going to get panicking and freaking out and communications are going to go bad, and that we just don't know what's going to happen and bad things are going to happen. I take that very, very seriously, and I think that that's probably an accurate description of the way the world works, right? So, this is kind of Blair and Bracken's work is in this tradition. But what we wanted to unpack was said, well, in addition to all of that confusion, fog and friction, complexity story, right, that cyber creates and expands, you also then have these additional new mechanisms that are introduced because you're relying fundamentally on capabilities that depend on secrecy for their efficacy. So by that I mean, if you have overcome all of these barriers of entry that I've just mentioned, okay? So you've spent years developing this penetration, you've got all the supporting intelligence, you're inside the other system, and you've got some ability to degrade their capability in some way, right? Early warning, weapons reliability, command and control, something, okay? You cannot tell the other side that you've got that, because once you tell them, they'll start taking steps to mitigate that. And if you depend on surprise, you can't reveal surprise for the sake of coercion, which depends on communication. So there's this fundamental tension between the secrecy and deception, which I think is inherent to the way that cyber operations are practiced, and clarity and openness that nuclear deterrence fundamentally depends upon. Secrecy, it may be useful for warfighting it can be very problematic for deterrence. So I kind of wanted to just go through in this paper and break out, hey, here are all these different mechanisms. Most of what we're talking about fall into this kind of fog of war, increased complexity category. But then there are these other ones, and interestingly, they are all concentrated on incentives for the attacker that depend on strategic disincentives to reveal these capabilities, and therefore a situation in which both sides do not actually understand the balance of power. They don't understand their common capabilities, and therefore they're going to be taking risks under very different cognitive frames of how the world works.
You're referring there, in a sense, to what's known as general strategic deterrence, which is, people have the ability to annihilate you, but they don't, in the moment, right now, intend to do so. But when you're at the brink of nuclear war, you're shifting from that on both sides of an enmity involving nuclear weapons. You're shifting into an immediate deterrence and then into a compelling for warfighting mode, and you're right at the brink in a crisis. Yeah. It's at that moment, as I understand your argument, that what you called a digital Dr. Strangelove may come into play with maximum destabilizing effect on the control, positive and negative, of nuclear weapons by either side. And how do you see a digital Dr. Strangelove working? Is it that, for example, a cyber move by one side may precipitate the other's AI to destabilize in some way the operation of the early warning system and assessment, and accidentally causing nuclear war? Or what exactly do you mean by digital Dr. Strangelove?
Okay. Let's put the Strangelove stuff aside for a second. I can get back to that. Well, okay. So why I use the Strangelove metaphor, right? I mean, one of the reasons that we all love and find Dr. Strangelove so darkly amusing is this is a movie that is fundamentally about people following the rules, right? I mean, most of the movie is about, soldiers doing what they're supposed to, these long sequences of Major Cog and his crew on the bomber going through all of their checklists, right? Armies showing up, they end up fighting their own troops, right? Everybody is just following the rules, but one madman, one hacker, if you will, has found a way to exploit a loophole in these rules to, start World War III because he thinks this is going to be good for his pure bodily essences, etc. Okay, so what I mean by Dr. Strangelove is that if following the rules, the very rules that are supposed to make nuclear weapons more reliable and more conforming with the strict always never criteria of nuclear command and control reliability, and now we're introducing software and hardware systems that are themselves dependent on a complex system of rules, right? Millions and millions and millions of lines of code. These are nothing but rules. These are deterministic rule-following machines. But there are going to be these edge cases which, by accident or malicious general Ripper type intent, might be exploited. So that was the reason for using that particular frame. Now, as far as like what scenario I actually envision, part of the reason of going through this whole exercise was to lay out that there are many different possible scenarios. Some of them are incentives that the attacker might have to escalate. Some of them are incentives that the target might have to escalate. Some of them might be shared, and some of them might come from the interaction of third parties, going to your multipolar story. Some of these incentives are going to be rooted in things that happen in peacetime, some in this crisis transition that we're talking about, and some in war. So the one that I was talking about in particular, this issue that that Eric and I have called the cyber commitment problem, is a mechanism that is concentrated on the attacker's side during a crisis and stems from the fact that the attacker has a capability which increases its power relative to the target, but it cannot reveal that target because it depends on secrecy. So in a crisis, you have a situation where the target may be more resolved, right? Imagine this is Kim Jong-un, and he's like, well, I am not as powerful as the United States, but I care a lot more about things than anybody else because my entire regime, my life, the entire area is at stake. So I am highly resolved to stand fast. The United States says, okay, you may be more resolved, but you don't have the capability that you think you have because we've owned your systems and they're not going to work very well. We're going to take some of them out left of launch and then, we'll clean up the few later on and maybe we'll risk Guam. Okay. And so you've got this situation where one side says, I'm resolved given what I know that I have. The other says, you don't have that, but I can't tell you. Now both sides are willing to take a risk, right? That's a very dangerous situation. At one point, they decide they're not in deterrence or compellence world anymore. They are in warfighting mode, and you start to preempt and take things down, or a signaling situation happens. Who knows? That is one mechanism that is focused on the attacker's use of secret cyber capabilities in a crisis situation. And then there's a similar, set of incentives that happen during wartime, right? Wartime, all right, you're starting to have a limited exchange, conventional or nuclear. You've got these cyber capabilities. Those cyber capabilities depend fundamentally on all this intelligence and planning preparation that you've done in the weeks and months and years prior. Because war starts to change the state of the world, all of your assumptions are starting to go bad. So if you're going to use that cyber capability, you need to use it soon. Okay. So that's a related incentive, but that is on the attacker's side in wartime. There's all these other things that can happen then on the target side, right? Maybe you start to realize that, your systems are going down. They're not behaving the way they are. You start to panic, right? And then you rush to do something. I don't think this is strictly rational, but that doesn't mean that it wouldn't happen in a real situation. The reason I say it's not strictly rational is that if a target is realizing that its systems are starting to be degraded, your rational actor should start to discount their relative position in the balance of power and then maybe be more likely to make a deal. Okay. Now, is that going to happen in the real world? Probably not. But it's important to then I think, distinguish what's driving these particular mechanisms because, there are things that we can do on one, but can't use to treat the other.
And what's fascinating in that dynamic that you're describing too is that even though they may not know for sure, right? The word on the street now is if you're Kim Jong-un, for example, and you read David Sanger, that there is something for you to be concerned enough about to potentially be even more inclined to.
Yeah.
And I don't think about this just in the East Asian context. There's other hotspots in the world, if you will, where there's actors who should probably be thinking along these same lines. Or if I were them, I would be. That you should be thinking much more earnestly towards first use. I'd be curious as to kind of how you see that, and really through so much of our conversations and games that we've participated in, that really seems to be an almost unavoidable outcome here, where first launch really becomes more probable as we head down these paths. Because what we're talking about here is cyber on one level. You start putting some of these more advanced techniques with information processing and compute power and all of the rest of it, some of these machine learning capabilities, that just makes the inclination that much greater. Just curious as to your thoughts, if you're seeing that is kind of the overall case.
So there's a lot of assumptions there that might be worth problematizing. The kind of situation you're talking about, this gets back to Peter's point about this distinction between general and immediate deterrence, right? General deterrence is the unwillingness of the other side to initiate a crisis in the first place. Okay. Immediate deterrence is crisis is on and now I'm making statements or military moves that then convey information. Okay. So immediate deterrence is a Cuban Missile type situation. General deterrence is most of the Cold War, where nobody even decides to initiate a crisis in the first place. So when I make this claim that cyber is poorly suited to signaling, I'm talking specifically about immediate deterrent situations. I think there actually is a general deterrent benefit to cyber, because in a post-Snowden and post-Stuxnet world, right, there's a general awareness that the NSA and others like it are very good at what they do, even though those revelations have burned some capabilities. They probably got more where those came from. They've got really smart people that know how to find more. Even some of those that have been revealed might still be available. So if I'm going to do anything, I need to take into account that I may be penetrated or the other side may be watching. Okay, so that actually should cause me to have less confidence in my capability and therefore be less likely to select myself into these crisis situations. Now, if you, despite all of that, decide to start going down the road towards a crisis, you've already taken that into account. Okay. So you've assumed that, well, I've got enough additional capability to take care of that, or I've got redundancies that will allow me to continue to generate sufficient risk for the other side to convince them that I'm more resolved than they are. In that situation, cyber or any capability that depends on secrecy for its operational tactical effectiveness is going to be not very good at all. Right. This would be like the Japanese in 1941 telling the Americans, hey, turn the oil back on or we're going to track Oahu from the north side with a bunch of airplanes. U.S. Navy would say, thank you very much. We'll scramble the ships. We'll reorient our defenses. And then, Pearl Harbor looks very, very different. So these capabilities cannot be used for credible threatening in that immediate situation.
Right.
So if you know it's there and you've already selected yourself into a crisis, does that make you more likely to use it? I think it's almost a wash at that point, right? I mean, you've already assumed that your systems aren't that effective, and yet you're deciding to stake everything on those systems anyway. How important is the cyber aspect of that itself?
That suggests your major nuclear weapon states with some degree of mutuality and symmetry in their forces, or symmetry of overwhelming ultimate capacity to retaliate in a way that's not acceptable, are least likely to go there. But those who are relatively very weak, at least in their own perception, against those major nuclear weapon states might go there because they're desperate and it's their action of last resort, an attempt to stun a superior adversary from either annihilating them or dismembering them with conventional forces. So it's precisely in the most asymmetric of the relationships within the nuclear weapons states hierarchy of 9 states where you'd expect that dynamic to erupt, or between the non-nuclear enemies of nuclear weapon states. For example, Israel's enemies might go there early if they feel they're about to be attacked with nuclear weapons.
Okay, I think I agree with you that the asymmetric dyads are the most dangerous ones, but maybe for a different reason. I think the asymmetric interaction is most dangerous because the stronger side is more likely to have the ability to use offensive cyber operations against the weaker, is more likely to have high-grade capabilities that it can't use, and is more likely to tell itself a story that it has a good chance of a mostly successful preemptive operation against that weaker power. Now, that puts the weaker power certainly in a gambling for resurrection type story where, hey, everything is on the line and nuclear weapons are their only choice. Absolutely, but I don't think that's a cyber story on the weaker side, right? That is a cyber story on the stronger side that has made the stronger side more likely to stand fast and press in these crisis situations.
I don't understand. Why wouldn't it be a Hail Mary shot for Kim Jong-un if he thinks that he is in fact about to be systematically removed from office, so as to speak, or physically annihilated? Why wouldn't he unleash both cyber and nuclear, or at least cyber all out, in an attempt to stun the United States or push third parties to play a restraining role at the brink?
It depends what you think his theory of victory is. I mean, I think that a human being who's up against the wall probably is going to throw everything that they can. The idea that you're going to have cyber first and that's going to get the United States to stand down, even though you've just signaled that you have an interest in mortally wounding their deterrent, right? That's probably not going to be the signal you necessarily want to send. Do you have confidence in your ability to do that if you're just going to do it and it's probably not going to work, and yet it's going to get detected and now send the signal that you are unambiguously aggressive? Then you know that retaliation is coming, and then you know that you've lost the game at that point. So using cyber together with nuclear, well, okay. I mean, like, cyber kind of goes out in the wash. It's the nuclear use that we're really, really concerned about. So, I have a hard time seeing what the rational pathway to escalation is in that situation. It doesn't mean that they're not there, but given that I have, based on people that I've talked to in this space, real doubts about the ability to have a real operational and controllable capability against the United States as a whole. And then if that's true, and you're talking about gambling for everything,
That's precisely the psychology of the moment, isn't it?
Sure, sure,
And
sure, sure. But I don't see the cyber part that makes that more likely, right? Like if you believe that you're gambling for everything, okay, and you don't have cyber, but you do have nuclear weapons, okay, that actor is going to use nuclear weapons. If you have cyber and nuclear weapons, you're going to use them both, but now they're going to use nuclear weapons. So we're equivalently in the same world. If they would not use nuclear weapons, but now they have some cyber, but the use of cyber is going to make it more likely that they have to use those nuclear weapons. Now we start to have to tell a story of like why that actually makes sense. Because if they're not going to use their nuclear weapons, that means that they see some way out of this crisis other than total annihilation.
well, I mean, I'll give you what is a prospective real world example. You could certainly envision a cyber attack on critical infrastructure involving nuclear reactors in allied states, specifically South Korea
Yeah,
and Japan, at the brink of a crisis, given that the North Koreans have said that they are willing to target those reactors in a crisis. They've made explicit
yeah,
threats.
yeah.
That would be a rational move for them in an escalation ladder where they could threaten something with a nuclear connotation without firing a missile. You know, it would definitely get everyone's attention if specifically, especially if they turned off a reactor. And this is not inconceivable given how those systems are set up in Japan and South Korea.
Sure, sure, sure. No, I'm not disagreeing for a second that this isn't possible and that we shouldn't be deeply concerned about the cybersecurity of our nuclear and electrical power systems. More just for day-to-day operations. I mean, there's all kinds of edge cases before we even talk about these nuclear interactions. So yeah, I think there will be interest in going after the cyber pieces. Just trying to talk about like what are then the mechanisms that interact with the nuclear piece. Now, if it's a nuclear crisis and then they attack cyber, that does make everybody, relax and make concessions to the North Koreans. We don't like that because we've given something up to the North Koreans. But if there's not a nuclear war, then maybe that's a good outcome. I'm not advocating this at all.
I think it gets back to an earlier question though as well. One of the first questions we started to talk about, where even if they've got that capability, where do we see that action being taken short of existential crisis, right? Where they would only take a step like that because they are really on the brink. It's very hard for me to consider how anyone would even, and this is why I struggle with the question of how far into a NC3 system people are going to meddle at risk
Yeah,
of really getting hammered for doing so. Um, but you go after South Korea's or Japan's nuclear reactors, you're asking for it at that
yeah.
in ways that, I mean, you have to seriously be worried about your own viability to go down that path.
The North Koreans, if they had the ability to not just attack the control systems of reactors, but to actually get into the NC3 system in the US or in an allied NC3 channel. Of course, there are no command channels involving nuclear weapons with South Korea and Japan. So they would have to go after STRATCOM itself, and specifically, they'd be going after the bombers or some early warning systems related to missile defense. Would they not go there? I actually, personally, I find that incredible. They wouldn't go there
Mm.
as early as possible at the brink of a war where they're convinced they're going to be attacked. They would go there and they would do it in a very overt manner, precisely to put pressure on the American command and to bring pressure on China and Russia to intervene.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. This sure is a rosy conversation. Can I? And I think we could spend a good deal of time even just talking about that scenario. That's a fascinating one that I hadn't thought about in as much clearly as much depth as you guys, Peter. Can I actually go back to a completely separate issue that you noted in your paper, John? It has to do with
Yeah,
non-state actors.
yeah, yeah.
You alluded a moment ago as we were going through things about how there may be third parties that are capable. Increasingly, we see that sort of activity in this domain, this quote unquote cyber domain, where you've got nation states, not just for plausible deniability purposes, but because they can just outsource the activity on a number of levels, really going down that path with increasing capabilities really broadly available at really low cost. I look back and I feel like I've been talking about this too much recently, but you look back at the what Dragos and FireEye have talked about with the Xenoprime malware, right? This stuff out there, and it only didn't work at Saudi Aramco because they made a mistake that set off an alarm.
Yeah.
And so the more people get their hands on this kind of thing, you see the increasing capabilities of the MOIS to really do some sophisticated stuff to get inside people's certs, et cetera, et cetera. But in your paper, you mentioned that we really don't have to be concerned about non-state actors when it comes to this piece. So I just was curious if you could pull that thread a little bit for us and talk about, if not now, from where you sit and the research you do, where do you see that becoming more of a threat? Where Hezbollah, as it takes all of its soldiers off the battlefield in Syria and has to find something for them to do, goes down a path where they're increasingly capable of conducting attacks in the cyber domain.
Yeah. So this does relate to the conversation that we were just having, which is a conversation about what is the likelihood that you will overcome the
Yep.
technical, organizational, and operational barriers to have this
Yep.
capability, right? Everything you just mentioned is kind of on the technical side. When I talk about organizational, operational, it's you want to have a capability that in this situation is going to have an effect that is somewhat predictable so that you have some confidence that it's going to do what you want it to. And when we're talking about this very rarefied warfighting situations, right, the possibility that it won't work, and it won't work in a situation that you can't possibly have tested it because there's no cyber range in the world that's going to, recreate these conditions, then you're going to have to start to think twice. You won't want to bet the farm on something that might not work. And if it only kind of works, it's just going to telegraph to the other side that you are a threat that needs to be mitigated. Okay, it's like if you're gonna shoot the bad guy, you better hit him because if you don't, right, then you're screwed. So when we talk about non-state and weaker actors getting this, that's kind of the situation that they're in. Now, when we talk about them using more sophisticated capabilities for kind of low-level probes and coercion and kind of this ongoing limited war gray zone intelligence, counterintelligence contests, whatever you want to call them, I think that is a really, really rich growth area, unfortunately. And so, yeah, you're going to see lots and lots of different actors embracing these capabilities, sometimes very sophisticated capabilities, in places that you can use them in ways that you can tolerate failure, that you can learn from failure, that you can have these ongoing interactions. Because that's what low intensity and intelligence conflicts look like. And so I think that's the nature of the cyber domain. That's the nature of a regular warfare, right? It's not the nature of nuclear deterrence. And sometimes we get confused when we try and take the technical and operational principles of the intelligence special operations world and then graft them onto the rarefied nuclear warfighting. So I do think that this stuff is diffusing. It's diffusing at the same time that defensive techniques are also diffusing. You've got this kind of situation going on in which there's more and more low-level conflict, low-level deception, low-level intelligence involving more and more non-state actors. But that does not mean that then they have the capability to go high order at will, or that they would want to, because they've got other more reliable tools to do that.
Gotcha. And
that's the thing, is that we're focusing too much on the tool and we're not focusing on the fact that any actor, whether they are a non-state actor, a weak actor, a major nation state, they don't just say, I've got cyber, I have to use cyber, right? They want to do something, and they've got a portfolio of means that they can choose from. So if they choose cyber, it's cyber out of all of these other tools, right? And if your goal is, say, a terrorist, right, is to cause terror, why would you pick the cyber tool when you can very cheaply and inexpensively have 10 DC sniper teams rove around, right, and guarantee that you're going to kill a lot of people? It's going to be terrifying and hard to find, right? Whereas you could have this cyber capability that's probably not going to work and is really expensive, and you're going to blow this capability and it won't work, right? So again, what do you want to do with it?
The same argument comes up in the counterterrorism field, which is why would a non-state actor spend all that time and money to get fissile material, make a warhead, and use it when they can just go out and use a anti-tank system to blow up a plate glass window downtown building and kill hundreds of people. And that seems to be so far the calculus that it's too expensive for too low a political and media gain for the major terrorists doing surveillance and reconnaissance of potential nuclear targets. We have real world instances of that. But the riposte is that there is this kind of aspirational motivation under the major terrorist organizations, non state actors, insurgencies that have global reach and have longevity. Some of them have spent 5, 10 years developing major weapon systems. Submarines, for example, have been developed by some of these players. They develop these capacities. They behave in ways that they gain the skills, the resourcing. They have R&D programs. So the question is, at what point do they come to that threshold where they make that effort? And in the cyber world, it's far cheaper than, it seems to me, and easier than acquiring fissile material and a warhead. So it seems to me hard to discount quite so easily that they wouldn't use cyber means to attempt to take some strategic asset hostage, particularly in a crisis where they can cast aspersion on a hated third party and behave in what in the Cold War was called a catalytic manner to cause adversaries to go to blows with each other with nuclear weapons without ever lifting a finger. If they can get into the game, there's a potentially, almost infinite payoff for the first terrorist to get into that business.
Well, I mean, this is the great dream of the information revolution and all the thinking that's been going on in the space, going back to the electronic battlefield and the revolutionary military affairs, right? That you can have, for very low investment, a very, very large, potentially infinite, payoff. And I think that what we've learned through the empirical cases that we have is that the barriers of operationalization are often much higher for the things that you'd want to do. There are other alternatives. And if you still see people using cyber, sometimes it tells you something, right? It tells you that they're not picking those other alternatives, right? It may tell you that they're not actually trying to harm you. They're actively pulling their punches. So that's an empirical question about how hard it is to actually, operationalize cyber for mass destruction. I think it's harder and less useful than is widely believed.
Right.
And then the second question is like, well, then under what conditions would you actually want to use that capability if you had it? And I don't want to downplay these risks. I think they're very real, and I think it's very important that we have these conversations and get appropriately freaked out about the increasing reliance on digital systems in our command and control systems and in our critical infrastructure more generally, because there are all of these possibilities that crisis interaction with states, with terrorist interactions with non-state actors, what have you be, that all of these bad things that could happen. We have to have those conversations, because if we're not thinking about all these bad things that can happen, we're not also then taking the steps to start to mitigate a lot of these things. And I think a lot of these fears about the brittleness of complex systems actually play into the very narratives that allow us to then, in an intelligent and reactive and adaptive way, start transforming these systems into more resilient, high reliability systems. And it's kind of like in the 30s, right, where everybody said, the bomber will not get through. You need to be terrified about, strategic bombing. Baldwin says there's nothing that the man on the street can do other than, suck it up and get bombed. But because everybody believed that, they worked really, really hard on building a radar system and an air defense system that allowed them to win the Battle of Britain, right? A triumph of air defense. They invested in that precisely because they were terrified of how potent this new technological ability to strike at critical infrastructure was. So cyber has kind of gone through several of these cycles where we see how exposed we are, and the process of probing and learning about that exposure through criminal breaches and espionage campaigns allows us to become better and better at detecting and mitigating and understanding some of the inherent resiliencies that exist in these systems. I'm concerned, but not panicking at this point.
Yeah, we've continued to have a very similar conversation with others as well. It's a fascinating, much broader conversation, but when you start applying it to things like nuclear weapons, nuclear command and control, the margin for error becomes so tight.
Yeah,
It's hard to right. It's hard to
Yeah.
Consider the notion that we've got time for that to play out, that cat and mouse game to play out in this space. With that, I will say, Jon, we've taken up an immense amount of your time. We cannot thank you enough, A, for the paper contribution to the workshop earlier this year, but for taking some time out today to talk with us about this. We look forward to continuing this discussion with you. It's not going to get any simpler.
It certainly isn't. Well, as the arms control toast goes, to peace may it require further study.
I love it. Fantastic. Thank you, Jon. For our listeners, stay tuned. We'll be back next week with a new episode of The Fourth Leg. Hit us up on Twitter, subscribe to the pod via SoundCloud, sign up for more Tech4GS information via the website, or just shoot us a note via email at info@tech4gs.org. Until then, thanks to everyone for listening. We look forward to hearing more of your comments and feedback.